So the topic today is working with adult protective services as not only service coordinators, property managers, and others who work in affordable housing for older adults, particularly in the Benet properties. Um, and and of course, the context is going to be working with them during the pandemic. Although I think most of what I will say will apply both, would have applied prior to the pandemic, as well as hopefully when that day comes when we are out under this. Uh, the opening slide I have here is actually from an earlier time, but that's the US Supreme Court when it was closed, actually during a government shutdown, not a coronavirus, but that isn't representative of adult protective services. So if I can, as we move to the next slide, say that APS is not closed. It's open for business, but they're not closed. That's really important. They're not closed, but they're doing things differently, and I'll be talking about that. But APS is, I had hoped to overlay on this slide APS open for business, but I'm not technically competent enough to do that. Before I talk about adult protective services, I'm going to spend just a moment on elder abuse data. And this is, we don't have a lot of good data about elder abuse, but we're getting better. And there's been one really comprehensive study that's the best that we have from New York, a very solid scientifically based study from New York, a prevalence study. And what it shows is the proverbial tip of the iceberg. We know from that study that for every one case of elder abuse to the attention of a responsible entity, like Adult Protective Services or law enforcement, there are another 23 cases that never come to light. 1 out of 23, which is mind-boggling. Is even larger when it comes to financial abuse cases. I believe it's 1 out of 38. I don't remember the exact number, but I think that's right. Next slide. So we all know, you folks know well, that we are an aging society and that the numbers of older people age 65 and older are rapidly growing, and they're going to represent some 18% of the nation's population in less than a decade. Another study found that 10% of elders are abused. So when we think about a nation of approaching 70 million people, 10% is 7 million people abused, older adults. In fact, current data suggests that the number of reports, now remember, 22 out of 23 don't get reported, but reports of elder abuse now exceed the combined total of child abuse reports and domestic violence reports. It's not surprising. The demographics of a rapidly aging society suggest that those numbers are just going to grow and grow and grow as the older adult population grows. 37% of active caregivers have said that the elder in their care has experienced financial exploitation with a loss, meaning a loss of money or resources. And reports to Adult Protective Services are just going up. I believe the latest data is nationwide, 18,000 reports of abuse each month going to Adult Protective Services. Next slide. Just quickly, NAPSA, National Adult Protective Services Association, is the trade association for adult protective service professionals, those at the state and local levels. And our job at NAPSA, where I serve as the National Policy Advisor with Kendra, is to strengthen APS through education, research, and advocacy, which is what we do. NAPSA is also home to the National Institute on Elder Financial Exploitation. We sponsored, for example, several weeks ago, each year we sponsor a World Elder Abuse Awareness Day event, usually held at the Securities and Exchange Commission in Washington, D.C. But of course, this year we had to go virtual. Now a little bit, next slide, a little bit about Adult Protective Services itself. APS carries out civil investigations, not criminal investigations, civil investigations of reports of abuse, neglect, self-neglect, and exploitation of vulnerable adults. And our purpose is to is to protect the victim to the extent possible, to try to stop whatever abuse they're experiencing, to remediate the abuse that they've experienced, which might include, if possible, recovering what they've lost, particularly through financial exploitation, and to, most important, to try to keep them safe in the community once the intervention has occurred. APS is the statutorily authorized entity under each state's law to receive and investigate reports of vulnerable adult abuse. In other words, every state has an APS program that state law has empowered or authorized to receive from people who have knowledge of abuse, like service coordinators, for example, to bring that to the attention of APS. Next slide. Just a little bit more about APS. I don't want to get too far in the weeds about it, but most of this nation's adult protective services programs, or well over half of them, are state administered, run by the state agency. 15% are administered by county governments, like Los Angeles County or San Francisco City and County, and the remaining 21% at the local level are administered in other through not-for-profit organizations. So, for example, in Illinois, at the local level, under the direction of the state APS program, local area agencies on aging and other not-for-profits do the APS work. But the most common model is a state APS office. APS is really victim-focused. It's a victim-focused social services response. We're about protecting and helping the victim. And as I mentioned, we receive abuses of reports, and our job is to try to remedy or reduce that abuse. I said that we do civil investigations, not criminal investigations, but APS works very closely with the criminal justice system, with law enforcement, with prosecutors, especially when there's a need to go criminally after the perpetrators, both to punish them for the crime that they've committed, or to try to recover lost funds in an exploitation case, although most typically you have to use civil remedies for that. And APS also works closely with aging services, area agencies on aging, and hopefully with service coordinators. Next slide. Unfortunately, because we have no federal funding yet going to adult protective services, it's been left to the states. So states are responsible for developing their own APS systems. So there's a lot of variance across the country. For example, there's no common definition of who is served or what services they receive by any given state APS program. That's left up to the state to decide for itself. So, for example, fortunately, APS in every state responds to reports of abuse that take place in the community, in people's private homes and congregate living environments. However, that's not the case in nursing homes. In nursing homes, about 50% of state APS programs have jurisdiction in nursing homes, meaning in the other 50% of states, nursing home residents do not have access to APS services. But virtually all states authorize APS to respond to reports in assisted living. But outside of nursing homes and assisted living, every state's APS program responds to reports in every other setting. And there is variation in who's eligible for APS and who responds to them. In 42 states, APS serves all adults over the age of 18 who have disabilities and meet state definitions of those disabilities or the impact of those disabilities on their ability to care for themselves. So that really includes a very broad population, as you can guess. Now, there are some states where APS serves only the 60-plus population. There are very few, there's a couple of states, and I'm thinking of Massachusetts, for example, and Louisiana, where there are two distinct APS programs, one for people 60 and over and one for adults age 8 to 64 with disabilities. So as you can see, there's lots of variation. Next slide. I don't want to dwell on this too much, but I want to spend a little time just saying there are myths about APS, and I want to try to be as factual about as I can. And the, the guiding value for adult protective service is that every action taken by APS must balance the duty to protect the safety of the vulnerable adult with the adult's right to self-determination. So following that guiding value, the principles of APS are that adults have the right to be safe. Adults retain all their civil and constitutional rights unless a court were to remove those. Adults have the right to make decisions that do not conform with societal norms, as long as these decisions do not harm others. And adults have the right to accept or refuse services. These are principles that are very different from those that guide child protective services, where children aren't in a position to make decisions for themselves or to make decisions that do not conform with societal norms that are bad for themselves, much less somebody else. So that's where APS and CPS, Child Protective Services, are very, very different. Next slide. So what can APS do? Well, it can examine and does examine all aspects of a report of abuse, neglect, or exploitation, or generally what we call maltreatment. And they work with the adults that they are serving to maintain their independence as much as it's possible, help them develop a case plan, do advocacy on their behalf with other agencies, arrange in-home services and other services that will help keep that older adult both independent as possible in the community, wherever that community setting is, and out of harm's way in terms of the abuse that they may have experienced. Next. APS cannot do. They cannot force services on a person who has capacity to consent. They cannot involuntarily remove someone from their home. Courts can make the decision to do that, but APS cannot. APS cannot provide services for which there are no available resources, obviously. APS cannot enforce the law. That's up to the legal system. And APS cannot reveal the identity of those who report abuse. Next slide. I mentioned myths. It's often thought of that when you go to APS, you may end up, the person who's the alleged victim might end up in a nursing home placement. APS strives to find the least restrictive intervention possible. And whenever possible, services are provided in the victim's home. The goal is to keep the person in their home, in their community, as long as they can be there safely. Next slide. APS workers who investigate a report of abuse can force both the victim and perpetrator to do whatever the APS worker deems necessary. Another myth. As I mentioned earlier, adults are assumed to be able to make decisions unless a court determines they are not capable of making those decisions. Then it becomes a different matter, of course. And then I think finally a third myth on the next slide. And that myth is when an abuse report is made, the main responsibility of the APS worker is to fix the situation to the reporter's satisfaction. The fact is, versus the myth, that APS, their job is to work with the victim, the person who is the subject of the report. That's who their client is. And so often APS will find itself with somebody who files a report about a family member, and they believe that a particular situation should have been handled a certain way. That may not be what that APS client wants. So to the extent possible, APS works to honor the wishes and respect the autonomy of the client, the older person or disabled person, again, as long as it's in a way that doesn't further the harm that they're getting or that they are harmful to others. Next slide. So what does APS do? They receive a report of abuse by phone or online. They usually investigate within 1 to 5 business days. And again, this varies from state to state. Some of it's laid out in state law, and they have to follow the state law about timeframes and things like that. But they usually triage based on what's considered. Is there imminent harm, imminent danger? That'll take higher priority than something that is less imminent. Typically, investigations last 30 to 60 days, but they can last a lot longer. And there's various interventions, and the ideal one is to put together a constellation of services, whether it's a shelter or, remove the perpetrator or find a new safe community living arrangement, bring in home delivered meals, whatever it might be to keep that person safe. Sometimes there's a need to get a protective order, and if absolutely necessary, a guardianship order. But again, that's up to the courts to do that. Next slide. And then lastly, for the moment, in fact, all but one state, there is a mandatory reporting law that says certain classes of people or professionals are obligated in the performance of their work to report suspected incidents of abuse, neglect, and exploitation. And typically those laws and states cover social workers, service coordinators who are service social workers, physicians, nurses, home health workers, mental health, EMTs, police, firefighters. And there are a handful of states, well, actually 15, not a handful, almost a fifth of all the states require all knowledge or believe to file reports. And then at least 11 states now require at least some of the financial professionals like bankers and financial advisors and others to report. And then that obligation, of course, then means them report to it may have them report to law enforcement, or it may have them report to both. And that's why collaboration between APS and law enforcement is so important, because to be truthful, law enforcement does not want to respond to many of the cases of elder abuse with all the other demands on them. And so APS is of a special importance, and APS will bring in law enforcement where it's appropriate to do that. So let me now turn, let's move to the next slide. I guess, Janelle, will you send out the slides to folks?
Yeah, we'll do the PowerPoint to everybody. And I just wanted to mention, it's my understanding that in 49 states, service coordinators, not just ones that are social workers, are pretty much mandatory reporters. So that's what I understood. What is the one state?
New York.
Okay, New York. Okay.
It's the one state that has resisted having a mandatory reporting law, and they've been pretty adamant about it. And in fact, I did a presentation just before this one, a little earlier today, and I got a quick email from somebody in New York State who wants to have a conversation about their situation. So this slide will allow you to click on or go to the NAPSA's website, and the website's down there. State. So the pandemic. I said at the beginning that APS is open for business, but they're having to do it differently. Most state laws require adult protective services to go out and respond in person to a report of abuse, neglect, or exploitation. That's their obligation under state law. And that has been suspended in most jurisdictions during the pandemic. Not everywhere, and it's really a function of having available PPE. If APS has the protective equipment available, they're going to, in most places, they're going to go out. They're going to go out and respond, because it's really tough to investigate a report of abuse remotely. It's very difficult. If I'm looking on a screen like we're looking at each other right now, I don't know that an abusive caretaker or family member is lurking in the background, monitoring what I'm saying and listening to what I'm saying. I have to rely on that exchange and be clever if I'm trying to remotely talk to, even if I can get access to a person about whom a report has been made. But the truth is, that's what most APS programs have had to do so far during the pandemic, is to do whatever tricks and clever strategies they can. You know, we're hearing about APS workers who will drive to a person's house and knock on the door and stand outside and try to determine if in fact they have been abused or neglected in some way. But it's not a complete answer. We also, quite honestly, just as in child abuse, the numbers of reports dropped significantly in many jurisdictions during the pandemic. So, was that a good sign? Does that mean that the pandemic means that there's fewer incidents of elder abuse? We don't think so. Just like in the child abuse arena, where we know that the preponderance of reports of child abuse come from those who interact with children outside of the family, teachers, schools, churches, places like that. Well, they don't see the kids right now. And so there's this tremendous fear that child abuse cases are going up and undealt with. We think it's the same with older adults. We don't know that yet, but we're going to find out here when this pandemic is over. We know that the research shows that social isolation is a huge predictor, a factor, a risk factor, I should say, for elder abuse, being socially isolated. So, you know, what went on behind closed doors? We don't know, but we know that what we're not getting are the reports that we used to get, because the service coordinators may not be seeing them directly in the same way. The bankers certainly aren't. Their physicians aren't. They're seeing them often on a screen, like I'm seeing you and you're seeing me. Um, you know, the whole array of service people that might interact, um, medical, legal, financial, social services, are not doing so with many people. So we believe that when this pandemic comes to a better place, when the doors open and people can go out, we're going to find that there's going to be a surge in the number of people who have actually, in fact, suffered some form of abuse or neglect during this time. So I say APS is open for business. They are, and they're doing everything in their power to figure out how to get out and do their job. And as PPE becomes more available, they're getting out more and more to be able to respond. There are some jurisdictions where APS has had to go out anyways, and particularly in states that are still insisting that there's a threat of imminent harm to someone, they can go. Um, it's what we're finding, what we're getting anecdotally, is because APS is obligated to go out. We're hearing from other people that go out to visit older people in their homes are saying, well, gee, it's unsafe for us to do that, but APS, you got to go. Why don't you go out there? So all that's to say that APS remains trying to do their job, doing it the best they can, often remotely. One of our goals legislatively, what I do and Kendra does for NAPSA, like we do for ASK, is try to help get resources and legislation to improve the work conditions and the circumstances. And so we're hoping that in the next Senate COVID-related bill that we hope they'll pass here in the next several weeks, that there will be some emergency funding for APS to get protective gear, PPE, and to get the kind of technology that you need, laptops and things like that, just like service coordinators need with the people you serve. APS doesn't have that stuff in abundance. One local in my community, where Janelle and I and Mark and Evan live in our area, one APS supervisor, I'm in the same agency as Child Protective Services. Child Protective Services has the PPE they need, and we have virtually none. And yet we still are in this particular jurisdiction going out, trying to go face to face to see the people that we need to respond to. So let's move on to the next slide. I'm going to move on to the next slide if that's okay. I won't read this slide to you, but what's really important, and probably even more so today in a pandemic, is the multidisciplinary approach to responding to abuse that's so necessary at the community level. APS really need to work with others like service coordinators who see clients and to do things on a multidisciplinary basis. Working with law enforcement, working with medical professionals, working with financial institutions. We're all in this together, and so there's no alternative to a multidisciplinary approach to responding to cases of abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Next slide. So knowing it's going to be tougher to build bridges with APS at a time like this, it's important to do so both now and in the future. And so I think it's better if it's possible, and many of you have probably done this, is to get to know your APS folks. You know, whether they're state level players or depending on the state, or if they're county based, if they're in a county government agency, or if they're in a county not for profit, like an area agency on aging in Illinois, for example, or same thing in Maryland, my home state. So I think to the extent one, figure out who is the APS entity that serves your community, serves your population, and if possible, connect with them so that, you know, talk with them, find out where they're located, find out, you know, in your state, what's their jurisdiction? You know, do they serve everybody over the age of 18, or are there certain the more you know in advance, the more likely you're going to be effective in both figuring out what you can report and to whom, and to have a connection at APS to make sure your matter is dealt with as quickly as possible. You know, you certainly need to know what your mandatory reporting laws are in your state to find out if in fact you are obligated to report once you have knowledge. Even if you're not obligated, if you are aware of it, we hope that you would obviously do the same, and we know you would. So it's really important always, but I think especially now, to work closely with APS. Now, it's APS may not be responding to phone calls in the same way, so you may have to go online to file a report. I know that's the case now in Minnesota, for example, but those are all things that I would recommend taking a little bit of time to find out now before you actually have to file a report. And it's important to know just exactly what APS responds to in your state. So, you know, you may, I'm just trying to think out loud a little bit here. If you have a person who's one of your residents in your building, you know that they have family members, and you know that those family members are not interacting with them at all, that they are completely divorced from them at the moment. That may be because of, you know, whatever circumstances, but it may be that they're neglecting their responsibilities to an older person for whom they have some duties. Those are the kinds of things that if you suspect a person is being neglected by those who are obligated to care for them, if you think they are in some way being abused financially or physically in some way, or in some other way emotionally at a time like this, that might be exactly the kind of thing you should be talking to Adult Protective Services about. And I just think if it's possible to have a conversation with APS, your APS workers, before you find yourself in a position where you're going, oh my God, this is awful. I need to file a formal report. And you know what happens then? I think the more you know in advance, and I think APS programs are going to be very willing to respond to that. So that's my main plea to all of you, to try your best to get APS, and we will be very happy broker that if you would like that. We're able to get APS to return our calls generally, and we'd love to link you if at all possible. I think I hit the
Okay.
magic.
Oh, I was just going to say, Bill, I had one comment. It was actually sent to me, just to me, from one of our viewers, that they're dealing with at least 4 residents who this person feels like are losing their mental capabilities. And they say that they've contacted APS, but to no avail. So I'm not really sure what exactly APS has said, but it seems that they are not opening up an investigation. And they're dealing with family members who refuse to accept the family member has issues going on, I guess, is what this says. So just wanted, sometimes I think that's why we brought Kendra last time too, was just to make sure people understood what APS does, how you can work with them, but within their framework. And as you said, sometimes, the client has the right to refuse. And I think that's part of it, understanding that. There may be more going on behind the scenes than you really realize. I don't know if it's in this case, but the fact is that you're not their client. The resident is. So the communications are going to be with the resident. That's my understanding, right? So if unless they're actually saying they just decline, I'm not sure how that works in declining to do anything. It sounds like it could simply be that, they're working with the client, not you. So you wouldn't be privy to what's going on. Is that correct?
And that's correct. And I know there's a lot of frustration sometimes with APS because they can't go back and say, well, let me tell you all that's happening with this thing that you referred to me. There's very strict confidentiality and privacy kinds of requirements that the programs have to operate under, and that can be a source of frustration. And just taking at face value what the person said to you in the chat. If I'm a service coordinator, for example, and I'm concerned that somebody's cognitive capacities are limited or failing in some way, I may be absolutely right about that. But for APS to intervene, it has to be about the fact that you believe they're being abused or neglected or exploited in some way. Now, it's cognitive impairment can be a key factor in self-neglect, which is within the purview of many APS programs. A person who's cognitively impaired may be engaging in behavior that is actually, dangerous to themselves. And that could bring in APS at that point. That's why having, I would hope that APS would, you could reach out to APS and have a conversation with them and say, look, we made 4 reports to APS in the last month, if that's the case, whatever it is, and nothing happened. Can you help us understand if that's true? Did nothing happen? Maybe we don't know. But if nothing happened, why did our report not meet the standard for taking action on it? And I think trying to force those conversations is really important for you to be both effective, make appropriate referrals, and to help make sure that APS steps in when they should. And again, if we can ever help connect you with that, I would do that. I see another comment just popped up, but I lost it.
I don't see another comment. And I think something that Bill had said earlier, which was really key, is getting to know APS, your local APS ahead of time. So that when, just as Bill said, then you can say, what was it about our reporting that didn't meet the criteria? We need to understand when we can call on you. So I know it's a hard time right now to deal with some of this stuff in that case, with the pandemic and not being able to meet physically, but you can call them. And even if you don't meet them face to face, or maybe even set up a Zoom, certainly being proactive. I think that's what we talk about a lot, being proactive, reaching out to these resources ahead of time so they know you and your building and your residents before there's an issue.
If I could, Janelle, Teresa had a comment that I just saw, one of your participants, and she said that when reports are made like about self-neglect, APS will come out in her case, but the resident or the older person themselves will refuse their service, including about financial exploitation cases, because they don't want anything formal to happen to their, let's say it's a son who's stealing their SSI check or whatever it might be. That's a tough one. That's one of those real ethical dilemmas for all of us, for APS. It's that right to autonomy, the right to make those decisions for yourself, that we can't override very easily. But I think that the collaboration, this is really that's a great example, because service coordinators and other people who work in B'nai B'rith properties and 202 housing, you have a relationship with those residents. If they're shielding a family member who's abusing them, your trusting relationship with them, perhaps collaboratively with APS, can get to the place where that person might be willing to take a little more of a stand to stop it and work with APS, and to work with the perpetrator too, the family member, to try to find some other solution. That's a very tough area. I remember very early in my career, a law professor that was a good friend of mine and an expert on guardianship law. He referred to our right to folly, and I think all of us in our hearts, if I'm 90 years old and I've got money in the bank and I want to go out and buy that hot red Corvette, that might be folly, but that's my right, unless somebody else has influenced me to buy that because they're actually going to end up with it. Those are tough issues.
And I think it is frustrating. At some point, as Bill said, sometimes people make really bad decisions. You did what you could, you did the mandatory reporting, and I think that's the most important thing, following that, and you can't determine the outcome. And I know that the other person that mentioned said that one of the residents was, APS did come out to assess them, and the manager, the management in the building did not know that had happened, but I don't think you get to know that because that's client confidentiality.
Right.
But says that the resident, the APS worker shared with the resident that it was the management office that called, which, unless there's some law in there, apparently this resident then called their son, and the son was very upset, and that's how they found out. Also, remember, I've dealt with a lot of your family members of residents. They like to make things up too, of how they found out information, and so sometimes you're not even getting the correct information. Or so I do think, again, this is where you really need to make that connection with the APS workers in your area ahead of time, so they really know you and know you care, and you have some sort of working relationship with them. Sometimes that doesn't always work, but I think it can't. It hopefully it would help, and I know a lot of you have done that. And again, this is frustrating. That's why we wanted to talk about this, because it is frustrating. It's frustrating for management. It's frustrating for service coordinators. It's frustrating for everybody. But, ultimately, you're looking out for the welfare of your resident. You're doing everything you can. And sometimes we can't help people more than what we're allowed to do. We can't force them. So I think that's, and sharing that it is frustrating sometimes. And I bet you anything, because just like when we do the resident leadership retreat and we have residents say how frustrated they are with other residents, and I recognize sometimes that resident from management or the service coordinator having been frustrated with them in a training, that you just don't know. Probably the people that are frustrating you the most, whether a resident, probably is frustrating APS too. Okay, and a couple comments, and then we will have to move on to our federal update because we do want to do a little bit with that. But I think this has been a really good conversation, and really appreciate
it. Has been. I appreciate everybody's input. In fact, is there a way for you to capture the comments?
I don't know. Gracie as host might know a little bit more of that about that. But people are expressing their frustration on the comments about, seeing even physical abuse, evidence of physical abuse, and it's very frustrating. Even doctors reporting it, and then, if the client refuses, there's not much you can do, but you have to report it, and you're doing the right thing.
If a situation like that where there's been physical, it appears there's been physical abuse because there's bruises or worse, and they're refusing to allow APS to do anything. The options are limited. You can either pursue it more aggressively legally, which is really a lousy thing to do if in most cases, and the victim is likely to dig in their heels harder on that. It can go to could go to law enforcement if it was obviously severe enough. That's a very mixed record on law enforcement stepping up to the plate on that because of all the other demands. I think to the greatest extent possible, it really involves working with that resident to try to bring them along so that at some point they are more willing to step up and not shield or protect somebody who is clearly abusive to them. Not unlike what we see in domestic violence, right? It's you got to work with folks.
Right. So also another comment was that they found it helps to get family on board, especially when there's mental decline and self-neglect.
Absolutely.
Okay. So again, we want to thank Bill so much for talking to us about National Adult Protective Services Association, NAPSA, and some of the limitations, certainly during COVID-19, but how they work and hopefully how we can figure out ways to work with them. And sometimes it is frustrating because in the end, it is different from Child Protective Services in that APS doesn't come in, swoop in, and just take over. It's civil, not criminal, as well, as Bill mentioned. So thank you so much, Bill.